now in session. On the second day of a siege, the gunfire matters less than the waiting. Day 1 announces violence. Day 2 reveals intent. This is the hour when men discover whether their cause can survive silence, thirst, and fear, whether power rests in patience, or whether impatience will reach for something larger, heavier, and harder to control. The record before this court does not open with motion. It opens with immobility. Lincoln does not awaken on this morning as a battlefield. It wakes as a trapped organism, homes sealed, windows boarded, streets evacuated of commerce, conversation, and mercy. The town is no longer lived in. It is endured. And endurance, Your Honor, is where the truth begins to leak through the myth. Because a siege is not simply an exchange of gunfire. It is a referendum on authority. Inside the McSween house, the Regulators do not advance. They do not flee, they hold. And in holding, they force the law to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when lawful power cannot move a single house from its position? Outside, badges remain visible, deputies remain armed, numbers remain superior, and yet the town does not bend. The defenders do not scatter. The walls do not answer to intimidation. This is not a story of chaos. It is a story of restraint pressed to its breaking point. By the second day, violence becomes less expressive and more bureaucratic. The rage of the street gives way to the memoranda, requests, justifications, appeals upward. When bullets fail to resolve authority, authority seeks validation from a higher shelf. And here, the indictment sharpens because the law's response to stalemate is not reflection, it's escalation. The question before the jury is not whether the Regulators were saints. That argument does not survive the record. The question is whether the institutions meant to contain violence instead widened its reach. When civilian streets become firing lanes, when families become collateral, when hunger and thirst replace warrants and testimony. At what point does law cease to be governance and become merely another armed faction, distinguished only by letterhead? The court contends that day 2 is where the battle stops being local. Not because the shots grow louder, but because the desperation does. On this day, authority does not ask how to end the siege. It asks who else might end it for them. And once that question is asked, once federal power is even contemplated, the siege has already breached its most dangerous wall. Not adobe, not timber, but restraint. The prosecution submits that day 2 is not defined by bloodshed. It is defined by erosion of patience, of jurisdiction, of the boundary between civil order and military force. Billy the Kid remains alive on this day. So do his enemies. So do the civilians caught between them. But something else does not survive intact. The idea that this conflict can remain contained. The record will show what happens when stalemate tempts power to borrow weight it cannot legally carry, and whether the law, in seeking to end lawlessness, instead invited something far more final into Lincoln. The court now calls day 2 to the stand. Members of the jury, this proceeding resumes with the record already under pressure. Part 7 enters day 2 of the Lincoln County War's most infamous siege. Not to relitigate how it began, and not to rush toward how it ends, but to examine what holding looks like when neither side can afford to move. Today's scope is narrow by design. This court will not render verdicts in this session. This court will not dramatize gunfights for their own sake. This court will instead examine conditions. We will place before you the physical facts of a town under suspension. Thirst, ammunition, fear, patience, and command authority stretched thin by time rather than fire. We will examine how the McSween house becomes less a refuge than a fixed legal problem, one that the law cannot solve without revealing its own limits. You will hear testimony, not in voices, but in actions, in who advances and who waits, in who possesses numbers and who possesses position, in how official authority behaves when it cannot compel obedience without consequence. This episode functions as evidence in proceedings. No verdicts will be issued, no moral accounting will be finalized. Instead, the record will be expanded layer by layer until the siege can be understood not as a standoff between men, but as a stress test applied to law itself. You, the jury, are asked to listen not for heroism or villainy, but for institutional behavior. When law enforcement is forced into immobility, what tools does it reach for next? When violence pauses, does wisdom enter or does impatience? As always, this court reminds you, myth survives on speed, history survives on restraint. A brief matter before the court: if you find this record worth preserving, if you believe stories like these deserve careful examination rather than inherited legend, your decision to follow, rate, and review this program materially affects whether this work remains visible. Algorithms reward noise, reviews reward diligence. This court depends on the latter. With that entered, the jury is instructed to set aside conclusions and attend only to conditions. Day 2 will not announce itself with spectacle. It will speak through delay, discomfort, and decisions deferred. The proceedings will now continue. I enter into evidence. At sunrise on Tuesday, July 16, 1878, day 2 of the Lincoln siege, the town wakes sealed. Every house still occupied by non-combatant civilians is boarded shut. Doors barred, windows nailed, curtains and blankets pulled tight. From the street, Lincoln appears abandoned. From the inside, it is inhabited by people holding their breath. The record shows no open thresholds, no figures moving between buildings, no morning commerce, no animals driven to water, no children released into the street. What remains visible is architecture under constraint. Adobe walls pocked with fresh scars, boards hastily nailed across windows, and the long single road lying empty under first light. Inside these homes, civilians are not sheltering, they're entombed. Families have withdrawn into interior rooms, away from the exterior walls. Furniture is stacked, mattresses leaned upright, trunks shoved into corners to thicken adobe already asked to do more than it was built for. The record does not show organized evacuation. It shows adaptation under fire. Thirst is already present. So is exhaustion. Most civilians have endured a full day and night of sporadic shooting. Wells in the river are unreachable without exposure. Lamps are kept low or extinguished entirely. Windows, even when boarded, are treated as liabilities. A silhouette is an invitation. A sound can become a target. The acoustics of the town shift. Rifle cracks echo sharply off sealed facades. The absence of the normal morning noise, voices, wagons, livestock, creates a vacuum that gunfire repeatedly punctures. Silence does not calm the town, it sharpens it. At first light, the tactical arrangement established on day 1 holds. The primary regulator stronghold remains the McSween house at the west end of town. Additional regulator elements occupy fortified structures, including the Montano store and allied positions farther east. These positions do not advance, they consolidate. Opposing them, Peppin's Murphy-Dolan force occupies key buildings, corrals, and rifle pits, commanding the street and approaches to the McSween block. Overnight and into the early morning, some Dolan men shift into nearby civilian houses, homes belonging to Ham Mills and Juan Chavez among them, transforming domestic spaces into forward firing posts. The net tightens without moving forward. The testimony is this. This conversion of homes into positions is not incidental. It places civilians between lines of fire even when those civilians remain inside. The law's presence spreads laterally, not decisively, occupying space without resolving authority. The siege becomes architectural. Control is measured in walls, not warrants. Inside the McSween house, the air is already stale. Plaster dust clings to floors and corners. Exterior windows have been shot out or deliberately converted into firing ports. Sandbags and stacked adobe form crude breastworks. Ammunition is checked and rechecked. Men rotate through the most exposed loopholes. No one is rested. Women inside the house remain primarily in interior rooms, but the record shows their labor persists. Water carried, minor wounds tended, order maintained where possible. The boundary between combatant and non-combatant is present in principle and eroding in practice. At sunrise, Billy the Kid, William H. Bonney, is inside the McSween house with the core regulator contingent. The house functions simultaneously as fortress and nerve center. Billy is not withdrawn. He is active, moving between firing positions, watching Dolan held houses near Mills and Chavez, monitoring approaches toward the Wortley and the house complex. The record does not place him asleep. It places him vigilant, coordinating overlapping fire, ensuring no position is left uncovered long enough to invite a rush. His role is informal but evident, an aggressive defender operating under constraint. Ammunition is finite. Exposure is constant. Movement is punished. No dawn assault comes. No order breaks the stalemate. Instead, both sides observe, measure, and wait. The town remains sealed, not by proclamation, but by fear and gunfire. Authority is present in numbers and badges, yet unable to compel the opening of a single civilian door. At sunrise on day 2, Lincoln exists in suspension. Civilian life is immobilized, tactical lines remain fixed, combatants hold rather than advance. The siege exerts pressure without resolution, converting homes into barriers and silence into a weapon. The conditions of confinement, physical, legal, and moral, are now fully established. By full daylight on Tuesday, July 16, 1878, the siege resumes its work. Shooting restarts not as a charge, but as an obligation. An exchange that neither side can abandon without consequence. The record reflects hundreds of shots fired the morning and into the day, not in sweeping assaults, but in cycles: exposure, response, silence, repetition. This is no battle of movement. It's a contest of endurance. The Regulators remain fixed in their strongholds. The McSween house continues to anchor their defense, its rooms converted into firing chambers, its windows reduced to loopholes. Other Regulator positions, most notably the Montano premises and allied buildings farther along the street, remain occupied. But the tactical gravity of the day pulls everything back toward McSween's walls. Men fire deliberately. Ammunition is finite. Each shot is weighed against return fire from the Murphy-Dolan positions scattered through houses, corrals, and improvised rifle pits. When a figure crosses open ground, rifles answer immediately. When no movement presents itself, the town falls into tense quiet, broken only by wind and the occasional crack of a long-range shot. Opposing them, Peppin's Murphy-Dolan forces used the morning to tighten its perimeter. The posse, augmented by Dolan men, Seven Rivers fighters, and Jesse Evans gunmen, consolidates into better cover. Civilian houses near the McSween place, including those belonging to Ham Mills and Juan Chavez. They're occupied and repurposed into forward firing nests. Domestic walls become part of the siege. Sharpshooters take advantage of elevation where it can be found, upper stories, rooftops, and hills behind town, raking the McSween house whenever movement betrays itself. This is harassment by design, to exhaust, to provoke, to test patience without risking a rush. The record notes at least one casualty of the Murphy-Dolan side during these hours. William Johnson of the Seven Rivers Group is struck in the neck and forced to ride for medical care at Fort Stanton. The wound registers the cost of even cautious exposure. Inside civilian homes, the daytime brings no relief. Though most houses remain boarded and silent, rifle fire continues to punch through wood and adobe. Families remain pinned to the interior rooms, counting shots, rationing water, listening as the valley amplifies every report. The distinction between battlefield and household grows thinner with every hour of daylight. Throughout the morning and daytime, Billy the Kid remains inside the McSween house with the core Regulator contingent. He does not range through town. His world is the interior perimeter of the building. The record places him cycling between firing positions, window to window, room to room, covering exposed angles and watching Dolan held houses across the street. His firing is controlled. Shots are aimed at visible targets. Men move between the Wortley House complex and nearby structures, or sharpshooters momentarily careless in Mills's or Chavez's houses. After firing, he withdraws behind adobe to reload, avoiding predictable patterns that would invite concentrated return fire. When not at a loophole, he moves through the house, checking on the other men, sharing observations from where fire is heaviest, helping redistribute defenders to prevent any single wall from becoming the obvious point of collapse. His role is not command by title, but by activity. No frontal assault materializes. The Murphy-Dolan forces probe and harass, but does not commit. The Regulators answer fire, but do not sortie. Each side measures the other through dust, heat shimmer, and sound. Authority is present everywhere, decisive nowhere. Through the morning and daytime of Day 2, the battle settles into a sustained exchange of gunfire without territorial change. Positions hold. Fire is continuous but calculated. Civilian risk persists under daylight conditions. The siege advances not by movement, but by attrition, testing ammunition, nerves, and the limits of restraint without resolving control of the town. By the second day's daylight, the record shows recognition, not victory. Sheriff Peppin and the Murphy-Dolan leadership assess the field and reach a shared conclusion. The siege has stabilized against them. The Regulators remain contained, but not displaced. The McSween house still holds. Fire has not produced surrender. Numbers have not produced movement. This acknowledgement does not come publicly. It arrives privately, in the language of memorandum rather than gunfire. The exchange of shots has clarified rather than confused the situation. The Regulators' advantage is positional and psychological. Their defenses are intact. The fire remains disciplined. The surrounding force can harass and contain, but it cannot compel the house to open without cost. Daylight exposes the limits of intimidation. The law faced with immobility reframes the problem. The question shifts from how to arrest to how to force an end. During the daytime hours, George Peppin, newly appointed sheriff, writes a brief note to Nathan Dudley at Fort Stanton. The request is specific: the loan of a howitzer. The stated belief is not that the artillery will be fired. It is the threat of artillery will suffice, that the mere presence of federal ordnance will coerce surrender where deputies and posses have failed. This communication is not a battlefield maneuver. It is an institutional escalation. The sheriff does not ask for mediation. He does not request additional deputies. He requests a military instrument designed for siege warfare. The note itself is modest in length, but expansive in implication. It assumes that civil authority may borrow military weight to resolve a civilian standoff. It assumes that fear of annihilation can substitute for lawful process. It further assumes that federal power, once invoked, can be contained by intention alone. The record does not show that this request is accompanied by warrants, judicial review, or civilian evacuation plans. It shows urgency framed as necessity. The timing matters. This request is made while civilians remain sealed inside their homes, while gunfire continues intermittently, while the Regulators have not attempted breakout or expansion. The stalemate has not deteriorated into chaos. It has merely resisted resolution. In choosing artillery as leverage, the law acknowledges its own insufficiency. The howitzer is not a policing tool. It is a statement that authority is willing to widen the scale of force rather than accept delay. This is not yet action. It is intent committed to paper. By Day 2's daylight, Sheriff Peppin formally recognizes the siege as a stalemate unfavorable to the immediate enforcement. His written request to Fort Stanton introduces the prospect of federal military involvement as psychological coercion. The condition of the conflict remains unchanged on the ground, but the judicial boundary governing its resolution has begun to shift. In the late afternoon of Tuesday, July 16th, Sheriff Peppin's courier reaches Fort Stanton. The note he carries is brief and urgent. It frames Lincoln as a town under threat from lawless force. It proposes a solution, not of arrest, but of intimidation. The loan of a howitzer. The premise is simple. Artillery need not be fired if its shadow alone can end resistance. The request is placed before Nathan Dudley, a federal officer already aware that Lincoln has been sliding toward open conflict. Dudley reads the letter with context the town itself no longer possesses. This is not the first appeal to reach Fort Stanton. Complaints have arrived from multiple directions. Lawmen, factions, civilians, each claiming necessity, each claiming urgency. The record reflects that Dudley is not ignorant of suffering in Lincoln, nor indifferent to civilian danger. But the law stands between sympathy and action. As a United States Army officer, Dudley is bound by federal restrictions that forbid military participation in local civil disturbances. Loaning a howitzer to a county sheriff for use against entrenched civilians and local combatants would constitute direct military intervention in a private war. It would place federal force squarely on one faction's side. The request, however carefully worded, crosses that line. Dudley drafts a reply. The denial is formal, restrained, and unambiguous. He informs George Peppin that he cannot comply. The law does not permit him to loan artillery. Federal weapons cannot be used to resolve a civilian standoff, regardless of how dire the circumstances appear. The tone is not conciliatory, it's firm. The refusal is legal, not negotiable. This is not passivity, it's containment. Dudley understands that providing a howitzer would not merely threaten the regulators, it would redraw jurisdictional boundaries. Once artillery enters the equation, the conflict ceases to be local in any meaningful sense. The record shows Dudley's frustration beneath the restraint. Local authorities have allowed the situation to metastasize into siege warfare, then turn to the army to finish what civil power could not. He refuses the weapon, but the denial hardens his view that Lincoln has become unmanageable under its own institutions. The law blocks one door, it does not still his attention. Dudley sends the denial back towards Lincoln by messenger. The letter travels while gunfire continues. It moves through a landscape already divided by lines of fire and fear. While the exchange unfolds at Fort Stanton, the conditions inside Lincoln do not pause to accommodate it. Inside the McSween house, Billy the Kid remains engaged in the same defensive routine established at dawn. He rotates between firing ports. He watches Dolan held houses for movement. He conserves ammunition. He prepares for escalation without knowing how near it already is. He is not consulted. He is not informed. His world remains adobe, dust, and rifle smoke. By late afternoon on day 2, the request for artillery has been formally denied. Federal law prevents the loan of a howitzer, and no military aid is authorized for offensive use in Lincoln. On the ground, nothing changes. The siege continues uninterrupted, but institutionally, the exchange marks a turning point. Civil authority has asked for military force and been refused, revealing both the limits of the law and the pressure building behind it. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, the bureaucratic machinery surrounding the Lincoln siege begins to move. From Fort Stanton, Barry Robinson, a private in the United States Army, departs alone on horseback. He carries a sealed note from Nathan Dudley addressed to George Peppin. The message he bears is a denial. Robinson's orders are narrow. Deliver the letter, nothing more. The document contains Dudley's refusal to loan the howitzer, an assertion of legal boundary in a conflict that has already tested them. Yet the route Robinson takes is anything but administrative. He rides west into a region already conditioned for violence. The road between Fort Stanton and Lincoln is familiar ground, but on this evening, it leads toward an active siege. Both factions inside Lincoln have spent the day firing at movement. Shadows are suspect. Riders are targets until proven otherwise. Robinson travels without escort, without banner, and without the protection that daylight affords. The timing ensures that he will reach Lincoln near or after dark. The purpose of Robinson's mission is formal notification. Peppin is to be informed that federal artillery will not be lent for use against the McSween house. On paper, this ends the request. In practice, it advances something else. A federal witness enters the field. By sending an enlisted man into an active combat zone, Dudley remains technically compliant with the law while placing the Army one step closer to direct entanglement. The record shows restraint in policy paired with exposure in execution. Robinson's presence in Lincoln will matter beyond the letter itself. His observations, what he sees, what he hears, what he later reports, will become part of the institutional narrative surrounding the siege. His ride is not neutral, it's evidentiary. At the moment of departure, Dudley has not authorized troops. He has not crossed the line that he just defended on paper. But he has allowed the conflict to touch the Army directly, if only through a single messenger. As Robinson rides, conditions inside Lincoln remain unchanged. Within the McSween house, Billy the Kid and the Regulators continue the defensive routine established throughout the day. Men rotate through firing ports, visibility deteriorates, silhouettes replace faces, ammunition is conserved, water is scarce, fatigue accumulates. The house prepares not for correspondence, but for night. Billy has no knowledge of the letter in transit. He does not know that the artillery has been requested and denied. From his position, the only facts that exist are the same ones that have defined the day. Dolan held houses across the street, intermittent gunfire, and the certainty that darkness will not bring peace. The siege does not announce bureaucratic shifts. It registers only force. At approximately 6:30, a federal courier departs Fort Staten carrying a formal denial of artillery support. The message moves toward Lincoln as daylight fades, bridging civil authority and military presence through a single rider. On the ground, the siege remains unchanged, but the institutional distance between local conflict and federal involvement has narrowed even further, without either side inside Lincoln yet knowing it. Just before sundown, Barry Robinson reaches the western approach to Lincoln. He is still carrying Nathan Dudley's written denial of the howitzer request. He is still alone. And now he is entering a town where movement itself has become suspect. The record places Robinson within rifle range of multiple armed positions, Regulator and Murphy Dolan alike, at a moment when nerves are frayed and daylight is failing. As Robinson rides in from the west, several shots crack out towards him. The record fractures here on attribution. History does not offer a clean answer as to who fired, whether the Regulators mistook him for a Dolan rider, Dolan men mistook him for a Regulator, or unaffiliated gunmen reacted to motion without identification. What the record does show is consequence. Robinson's horse reacts violently. Whether struck or spooked, it throws him. Robinson hits the ground under fire. He is not wounded. He regains control. He remounts. The ride continues. Despite the incident, Robinson presses into town and makes his way to the Wortley Hotel, a central node of the Murphy-Dolan activity, where he reaches James Dolan and delivers Dudley's written refusal. The denial is now in local hands. Robinson's account does not end with delivery. In later reports, he emphasizes that he was fired upon while entering Lincoln. An armed soldier on official duty, unhorsed by gunfire. The phrasing matters. It reframes the siege not merely as a civil standoff, but as a place where federal personnel are no longer immune to its violence. For Dolan's faction, already frustrated by stalemate and refusal, Robinson's experience becomes confirmation rather than anomaly. The letter denies artillery. The ride supplies grievance. During these moments, inside the McSween house, Billy the Kid remains at his post. He and the other Regulators continue their late-day routine, watching Dolan held houses, trading occasional shots, conserving ammunition, bracing for the uncertainties of nightfall. No maneuver is attempted. No message reaches them. Any shots heard from the western edge of town register only as more gunfire in a day already defined by it. From within McSween's walls, Robinson's fall is indistinguishable from any other burst of violence. There is no indication that Billy or the Regulators understand in that moment that a single rider's experience will later be cited as evidence that soldiers were fired upon. The siege does not announce its turning points. It buries them inside routine. The proceedings findings. Before sundown on day 2, a federal courier entering Lincoln is fired upon, thrown from his horse, and nonetheless completes his delivery to the Murphy-Dolan leadership. The ground situation remains unchanged. Regulators hold, the seizures contain, civilians remain trapped. Institutionally, however, the incident introduces a new claim into the record, that federal personnel have been exposed to hostile fire, altering how the siege will be interpreted beyond Lincoln streets. In the evening hours inside the Wortley Hotel, the Robinson incident is given a name and an origin. James Dolan informs Barry Robinson that the shots fired at him came from the Regulators inside the McSween house. The assertion is immediate. It is stated as fact. Robinson does not challenge the claim. He's unfamiliar with the precise geometry of Lincoln's firing lines. He has just been unhorsed under fire. He has no immediate means of identifying where the shots originated. In this condition, he accepts Dolan's explanation without investigation. The record notes competing possibilities. Men aligned with Dolan were posted at the House building and around the Wortley itself, positions that also commanded the western approach. Confusion, misidentification, or self-interested framing cannot be excluded. History offers no ballistic certainty here. What matters is not what can be proven, but what is accepted. Robinson completes his mission. He delivers Nathan Dudley's written denial to George Peppin and Dolan. The howitzer will not be provided. The question is closed. Another opens. Peppin and Dolan now possess two converging elements: a federal refusal that frustrates their attempted escalation, and a soldier's account that he was fired upon, now attributed to the Regulators. Together, these form a narrative. The conversation at the Wortley is no longer tactical, it's political. The Regulators are reframed, not merely as armed men resisting arrest, but as aggressors who have fired on a uniformed representative of the United States Army. This distinction matters profoundly beyond Lincoln streets. The claim does not require proof to function, it requires repetition. I enter into evidence. During these same evening hours inside the McSween house, Billy the Kid remains unaware of this reframing. He and the other Regulators continue their defensive posture under sporadic fire. They rotate through loopholes. They manage fatigue, thirst, and dwindling comfort. Their attention is fixed outward, on Dolan-held houses, on movement in the darkening street. No message reaches them. No accusation is delivered. From inside the adobe walls, the Robinson incident registers only as another burst of gunfire among many. The testimony is this: Billy does not know that this evening his position is being named as the source of fire on a U.S. soldier. He does not know that this attribution will soon travel back to Fort Stanton as fact. He remains a defendant without notice, accused in absentia. The siege teaches men to listen for bullets, not words. The findings are this: by the evening of day 2, the firing incident involving a federal courier has been formally attributed, without investigation, to the Regulators in the McSween house. Colonel Dudley's denial of artillery has been delivered, but its impact is eclipsed by a new claim. The U.S. military personnel have come under fire. On the ground, nothing changes. Institutionally, the conflict's narrative has shifted, laying the groundwork for direct military involvement. As night falls, George Peppin issues orders for his men to continue firing into known Regulator positions. The instruction is not tactical in ambition. It is pressure applied for its own sake, harassment meant to remind the besieged that encirclement remains intact. The shots strike adobe and wood, windows shatter further, walls chip, no breach is achieved. I enter into testimony that darkness strips the gunfire of effectiveness. Targets vanish, returns diminish, ammunition is conserved. What remains is noise and fear, psychological force in place of physical gain. Over time, even this tapers off. Rifles fall quiet. Men on both sides redraw into their shelters. The silence that replaces gunfire is not peace. It is vigilance without release. I enter into evidence that inside the McSween house, conditions have worsened. Heat lingers in the battered adobe. Smoke and plaster dust cling in the air. Water is nearly gone. Thirst has begun to impair judgment and strength. Men have slept only in fragments, rifles within arm's reach, bodies slumped against walls or floors. Among them is Billy the Kid, still rotating watch, still prepared for a night rush that never comes. The house holds, but at increasing human cost. With firing ceased, the thirst becomes critical. A decision is made that carries no tactical advantage and immense personal risk. Susan Gates, accompanied by some of the Shield children, leaves the cover of the McSween house after nightfall to fetch water from the Rio Bonito. They go unarmed. They move quietly, knowing that any misinterpretation could be fatal. No regulator escorts them. Armed protection could mark them as combatants. I enter into evidence that as they make their way to the river and back, Dolan's men do not fire. Whether from restraint, custom, or exhaustion, the armed perimeter holds its fire. The women and children return unharmed, carrying water back into the besieged house. This act alters no positions. It resolves no claims. The testimony is this: inside McSween's walls, the water brings brief relief. Men drink. The most debilitated recover enough to continue. Gratitude is present, but so is the understanding that mercy is temporary and conditional. The defenders know the gesture does not signal leniency to come. It signals only that the night for the moment has spared them. Across town, Peppin's men rest uneasily. They have not broken the stronghold. They know federal attention is sharpening. The stalemate persists, and with it, the risk that the conflict will soon exceed local control. Through the night of day 2, the gunfire diminishes and ceases without resolution. The siege continues under silence, thirst, and exhaustion. A brief humanitarian passage to the river allows water to reach the McSween house, temporarily sustaining its defenders. Tactical conditions remain unchanged. Human strain deepens on both sides as the conflict pauses, without ending. As the night deepens and slides toward early morning on Wednesday, July 17th, the siege tightens into two separate places. One in Lincoln, 1 miles away at Fort Staten. Both move independently. Both move towards the same consequence. Inside the McSween house, at least 2 windows have now been completely shot out. These are no longer firing ports. They are voids. Glass is gone. Frames are chewed away. Night air moves freely through the openings, carrying dust and the awareness that nothing now interrupts a bullet's path but distance and luck. Defenders pull back from these exposures. Furniture is dragged. Trunks are stacked. Blankets and boards are pressed into service. Not to stop rifle fire, but to reduce visibility. The house is still standing, but its margin of safety is shrinking room by room. The damage builds. Each destroyed window registers not merely as loss of material, but as loss of option. Inside, Billy the Kid and the remaining regulators continue rotating watch through safe loopholes. Exhaustion is no longer episodic, it's constant. Men confer quietly. Rifles are checked. Ammunition is counted again. Billy's role in these hours is not dramatic. It's managerial. He checks positions. He confers with McSween and the more experienced fighters. He helps decide which rooms must remain manned and which must be abandoned as untenable. There is no expectation of relief, only the discipline of holding until forced otherwise. The water fetched earlier has postponed collapse, but not cured it. Thirst remains close. Sleep comes only in fragments. Every new hole in the walls reinforces the understanding that the house is being slowly opened by attrition. While Lincoln contracts inward, events at Fort Staten expand outward. Barry Robinson returns from Lincoln and reports to Nathan Dudley. His account is emphatic. He states that he was nearly shot while entering town. He identifies the fire as coming from the Regulators near the McSween house, repeating the attribution given to him in Lincoln. The report is delivered as fact. The effect on Dudley is immediate. The legal restraint that he maintained earlier in the day collides with a different obligation. the safety and honor of his command. What had been a civil disturbance now appears, through Robinson's report, as a place where a federal soldier can be fired upon while carrying orders. That distinction matters profoundly within military culture. Late that night, moving into the early hours of July 17th, Dudley convenes a meeting with his officers. They review what they know: the ongoing siege, the presence of women and children under fire, the failure of local law to resolve the conflict, and now the claim that a U.S. soldier has been targeted. The legal barriers remain, but the context has changed. By the end of this conference, a decision has been reached. The officers agree that they will ride into Lincoln at dawn. Officially, the purpose is investigation and protection. Practically, it is the assertion of federal presence where local authority has failed. Troops will go. Artillery will accompany them. This decision is made while the McSween house sits in darkness, its windows blown out, its defenders unaware. Billy the Kid does not know that miles away, his position has become central to a report that will justify military movement. He listens instead for footsteps, for gunfire, for the creak of boards. Two worlds move at once. One contracts and one advances. In the late night and early morning hours, bridging July 16th into July 17th, the McSween house sustains further structural exposure, increasing risk to its defenders. Simultaneously, a federal report alleging gunfire directed at a U.S. soldier prompts Colonel Dudley and his officers to decide on direct military entry into Lincoln at dawn. The siege remains unresolved on the ground, but the conditions governing it has shifted decisively beyond local control. The court reconvenes not to resolve, but to reckon. Day 2 ends without a charge, without a surrender, without a body carried from the street. And yet, this day extracts its toll with precision. Windows are removed, water becomes currency, words become weapons. Authority begins to speak less through law and more through proximity to force. The record is clear on one point. Nothing decisive happens in Lincoln on this day by accident. The Regulators do not advance because they cannot afford to. The besiegers do not withdraw because they cannot explain retreat. And the law, facing a house it cannot move, does not pause to reflect. It looks upward. This is where the myth fractures. Popular memory frames sieges as contests of firepower, courage, or criminal daring. But the record before the court shows something quieter and more corrosive. It shows erosion. It shows how stalemate tempts institutions to redefine necessity, how uncertainty invites escalation dressed as investigation, how accusation, once spoken and repeated, becomes operational truth regardless of proof. On this night, Billy the Kid does not expand his legend. He shrinks into a house with fewer windows than it had at dawn. He becomes less outlaw and more fixed point, an object around which others maneuver, narrate, and justify. The law, meanwhile, does not regain control. It borrows gravity. A single rider is fired upon in a town where everyone fires at movement. No tribunal examines angles or origin. No warrant adjudicates responsibility. The claim is accepted because it is useful, and usefulness, Your Honor, is not the same as truth. By dawn, soldiers will ride not because the siege demanded it, but because the story now allows it. Day 2 teaches this jury that containment fails not when bullets fly, but when patience does. When restraint is treated as weakness, when institutions frustrated by immobility decide that escalation is clarification. No verdict is rendered here, but the court submits that the most dangerous moment of the Lincoln battle is not marked by flame or by death. It is marked by agreement, quiet, lamplit, and unchallenged, that the problem is no longer local. And once that agreement is made, the siege has already escaped its walls, no longer contained by adobe, warrants, or daylight, but carried forward by authority itself. Members of the jury, this court thanks you for your attention to the record. The siege has not yet broken. The shots have been quieted, but the machinery of escalation has begun to turn. Day 2 closes not with resolution, but with paperwork, accusation, and intent, each as consequential as gunfire. What you have heard in this session is not legend, not folklore, but the anatomy of how violence expands when institutions abandon restraint. Before this court adjourns, the record requires several matters to be entered plainly and without embellishment. If the human cost of this history matters to you, if the civilians sealed inside adobe homes, the children rationing water, and the lives erased by bureaucratic decisions deserve remembrance, you may participate in the Adopt a Victim program at www.darkdialogue.com. That program exists to restore names, stories, and dignity to those flattened by myth. Additional victim essays and case documentation can also be found at that website, where the written record continues beyond this courtroom. If you wish to support this work directly and help sustain long-form, evidence-driven historical accountability, you may do so at patreon.com or on Ko-fi. Each platform supports a different tier of access and preservation. None alter the verdicts. All help keep the record alive. For correspondence, source material, or formal inquiries, the court may be reached at info@darkdialogue.com. If you find value in this proceeding, the court asks one final civic act. Like, share, subscribe, and, where available, ring the notification bell. These actions do not serve vanity, they serve visibility. Algorithms bury careful work quickly. Your engagement is how this record remains accessible to future juries. Dark Dialogue is available on all major podcast platforms alongside companion programs, Dark Dialogue Main Show, Dark Dialogue Shadow Chat Sessions, Dark Dialogue Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Distilled, Unraveled Truth, all of which continue to examine power, violence, and accountability beyond the American frontier. This court will reconvene. Until then, remember, history does not demand belief, it demands attention. Stay vigilant, stay engaged, and make the guilty face the gallows.